Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine picking up a book written over 2,500 years ago,
Wow.
a military strategy guide from ancient China, and finding its principles quoted by someone like Oliver Stone.
Right, in Wall Street of all places.
Exactly, as essential guidance for navigating, the ruthless world of finance. How does that happen?
It's genuinely remarkable, isn't it? That surprising resonance, how these ideas just leap across millennia and different contexts. It's really at the heart of why this text is still so powerful.
And that's precisely what we're diving into today, our source material. We're looking at excerpts from James Clavell's edited edition of Sun Tzu's The Art of War.
A classic edition.
And our mission,
Right.
well, it's to take this incredibly dense, ancient work and really pull out the potent nuggets, the timeless wisdom about competition, strategy, achieving your goals.
Not just on a battlefield.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But in pretty much any challenge you face in life, we're aiming to cut through the density to find the really powerful ideas.
So, Sun Tzu himself, the sources tell us he wrote this over 2,500 years ago in China.
2,500 years, just think about that. And right from the very first lines, the text hammers home its importance. It's described as, absolutely vital for the state.
Life or death stuff.
Yeah, concerning life or death, the path to safety or ruin, something that should, under no circumstances, be ignored. This wasn't just casual reading back then.
And what's fascinating is how that ancient urgency somehow translates, directly to modern applications. The foreword in our source material points this out,
Oh, yeah?
especially about espionage. It makes the pretty significant claim that The Art of War was required reading in the Soviet political military hierarchy.
Really? Required reading.
That's the claim, and that it even influenced Mao Zedong's Little Red Book.
So it's not just boardrooms and movies. It was shaping superpower strategy in the 20th century.
Seems like it.
And that Oliver Stone anecdote you mentioned earlier, quoting it from Wall Street, it just shows how these concepts have seeped into incredibly unexpected domains.
Definitely. And the foreword explicitly draws parallels. It compares Sun Tzu's insights to works like, say, Machiavelli's The Prince.
Oh, okay.
Or Musashi's The Book of Five Rings. The argument is these aren't just military principles. They apply just as much to business conflicts, debates, even navigating personal struggles.
And James Clavell himself, the editor of this version we're using, he seems to have had this profound personal connection. His story in the foreword.
Finding it in Hong Kong.
Yeah, finding it in Hong Kong back in, 1977. And how deeply it influenced his own life and writing, especially his novel, Noble House. It suggests this wisdom isn't just academic. It, really resonated with him personally.
Which brings us to where Sun Tzu actually begins laying the foundation. Before you even think about conflict, you have to understand your environment completely.
Right.
He introduces what he calls the 5 constant factors, things that are absolutely essential to consider in any strategic undertaking.
Okay, the 5 factors. He lists them. The moral law, which he describes as getting the people totally in sync with their ruler.
Unity, basically.
Yeah, unity. Then heaven, understanding things like time, seasons, climate. Earth, that's the terrain, distances, the ground you're on.
Makes sense.
Then the commanders, their virtues like wisdom, sincerity, courage, discipline. And finally, method or discipline, how the army is organized, structured, logistics, all that practical stuff.
And the source makes it incredibly clear. The general who masters these 5 factors wins. The one who ignores them fails. Simple as that. It's about a holistic understanding of every dimension of the situation.
And woven right into these foundational ideas, arguably the most famous concept from the entire book is introduced here in Chapter 1. All warfare is based on deception.
Yeah, that's the big one. And it isn't just a tactic for Sun Tzu. It's like a fundamental truth of conflict.
How so?
He gives these classic examples.
Yeah.
Appear far away when you're actually near the enemy and seem near when you're far off. Use bait to lure them in. Feign disorder when your forces are actually perfectly disciplined. Strike when the enemy is least expecting it, when they're unprepared. It's all about manipulating their perception of reality.
And he doesn't shy away from the brutal costs either. The cost of getting it wrong, or even just the cost of fighting itself. Looking at the section on waging war.
Yeah, the economics of it.
He details the immense expense, resources, mentions the cost for thousands of chariots, huge daily outlays, and the strain on the population. Describes 700,000 families struggling.
That staggering cost leads directly to one of his most critical principles from this section. Prolonged war exhausts the state.
Right. Makes sense.
Therefore, speed and swift victory are paramount. He talks about the wise general not just relying on their own supply lines,
Yeah.
but feeding the army from the enemy's resources, capturing and using their equipment, even their soldiers. The goal is victory quickly and efficiently, not some drawn-out destructive campaign.
It really puts into perspective the idea that winning isn't just about beating the opponent. It's about doing it efficiently. And the fate of the state rests squarely on the leader's shoulders. Their ability determines whether it's peace or ruin.
Which is exactly why the highest form of victory, according to Sun Tzu, as described in Attack by Stratagem, is conquering the enemy without having to fight at all.
Without fighting.
That, he says, is supreme excellence.
Win before the battle even starts. And he gives a hierarchy, doesn't he? How to attack from best to worst.
He does. The absolute best is disrupting the enemy's plans before they can even act on them.
Cut them off at the source.
Exactly. Second best is disrupting their alliances. Third, attack their army in the field. And the worst possible option, attacking fortified cities. Just a meat grinder.
This ideal of avoiding direct confrontation, it loops back to maybe the most quoted line from the whole text, also in this section.
If you know the enemy and know yourself,
You need not fear the result of 100 battles. Yeah.
it's about that symmetry of knowledge, because the variations he gives are critical too.
Right. If you only know yourself, but not the enemy.
You're looking at 50-50 odds, maybe one defeat for every victory.
Wow, great.
But if you know neither yourself nor the enemy, well, you're heading for certain defeat every single time.
It feels incredibly relevant to almost any competitive situation, a job interview, a business negotiation.
Absolutely. And knowing yourself also means understanding your own capabilities and limits relative to your opponent. Sun Tzu gives clear rules based on this relative strength.
Like what?
Well, if you're 10 times stronger, surround them. 5 times stronger, just attack directly. If you're double their strength, divide your forces, attack multiple points.
Okay.
If you're equal, engage very carefully. If you have less strength, evade them. And if you have much less strength, avoid confrontation entirely. It's a cold, hard assessment of reality.
And he warns that even with a capable army, a leader, or maybe the ruler above the leader, can mess things up.
Oh yeah, interference from the top.
He highlights 3 ways a ruler who doesn't get military principles can bring misfortune. Hobbling the army by meddling with strategy.
Telling the general how to fight when they don't understand.
Right, or agitating the troops through bad communication or unclear orders, and shaking their confidence through, indecisiveness or arbitrary actions.
The commander is the state's defense, he says, but interference from above can be totally ruinous.
So that's the foundation laid out. Understand the situation, the costs, deception, nonviolent victory.
Now we get into the nitty-gritty, how you actually navigate and fight once you're in motion. It starts with tactics.
And this is where it gets really practical. Sun Tzu says, good fighters make sure they cannot be defeated first.
Secure yourself.
Exactly. Secure yourself first, and then wait for the opportunity to defeat the enemy. Avoiding defeat is largely in your control. The chance to beat the enemy comes from them, from their mistakes or weaknesses.
Defense is for when your strength is inadequate. Offense is for when you have a superabundance. Makes sense.
This leads to the idea of unseen victory. The highest excellence isn't the big, bloody, visible conquest everyone talks about.
No glory in that, necessarily.
Right. It's winning effortlessly, when it's easy, before the struggle is even obvious to ordinary people. Victory achieved quietly, without fanfare or massive damage.
He then tackles managing large forces in the section on energy. How do you control huge numbers of people?
Good question.
He says it's like managing small numbers. It all comes down to organization, clear signals,
Communication.
and leveraging both direct and indirect methods in battle. He describes these methods combining endlessly, like the 5 colors or the 5 musical notes or tastes.
Infinite combinations.
Exactly. And he vividly describes this concept of energy or momentum, like water gushing from a dam or a boulder rolling downhill. You build it up and unleash it.
Which ties right into his approach to weak points and strong. The fundamental principle is simple. Attack where the enemy is weak, avoid where they're strong.
Seems obvious, but hard to do consistently.
True. He uses the analogy of water again. It flows downhill, avoids high ground, rushes to low ground. Victory requires constantly adapting your tactics based on what the enemy is doing.
Just as water has no fixed shape, he says, there are no constant conditions in warfare. You have to be fluid, adaptable.
That adaptability is key.
Mhm.
In maneuvering, he talks about the challenge of making a long, roundabout route seem direct.
Turning disadvantage into advantage.
Yeah. But he also highlights the very real practical costs of movement. Marching troops too fast or too far, he gives an example, like marching double the normal distance.
You push too hard.
Right. And you might lose half your force to exhaustion or straggling before you even get there. Logistics are paramount and really costly.
This need for adaptability is reinforced in variation in tactics. A general has to understand how to respond properly to different types of ground, different situations.
And he lays out those 5 dangerous faults a general must avoid.
Oh yeah, the pitfalls. Recklessness that just leads to death. Cowardice leads to capture.
Yeah.
A quick temper makes you easily provoked by insults. A sensitive sense of honor makes you vulnerable to shame or manipulation. And over-solicitude for his men.
That sounds good, though, caring for your troops.
It does, but he means being so worried about them that it leads to worry and indecision, paralyzing action. Any of these flaws can ruin an army.
He even gives super practical tips for the army on the march, focusing on how to set up camp and read the environment to understand the enemy.
Reading the signs.
Exactly. Observing dust clouds high and sharp means chariots are coming. Low and broad means infantry.
Little details.
Yeah. Or birds suddenly rising in alarm could indicate an ambush nearby. It's about being incredibly observant, reading all the subtle signs.
And reading the environment leads directly to the section on terrain. He breaks down 6 specific types of ground.
6 types.
Accessible ground, entangling ground, temporizing ground, narrow passes, precipitous heights, and ground that's a great distance from the enemy. And he gives guidance on how to operate in each.
And he links understanding that terrain directly to the outcome, right? He lists 6 ways an army can be defeated.
And many stem directly from the general messing up regarding the ground or their own troops. Things like flight, insubordination, collapse, ruin, disorganization, rout. Bad leadership often tied to misreading the situation.
Finally, in this whole section on navigating situations, he discusses the 9 situations, or 9 types of ground, like dispersive, facile, contentious, open, serious, difficult, hemmed in, and desperate ground.
Lots of categories.
He gives a general rule for how to act in each. And a key insight here is that soldiers fight hardest when they're in a desperate situation.
Backs against the wall.
Exactly. When it's literally fight or die, their energy is totally focused on survival. No other option.
So we've covered planning, costs, deception, movement, tactics, reading the ground, leadership flaws, a lot.
Yeah. But what about the truly critical edge? The secret weapons, maybe? He touches briefly on attack by fire.
He does. List 5 methods for using fire against the enemy's camp, their stores, baggage, arsenals, or just hurling fire amongst their troops.
He's pretty destructive.
It is. And he emphasizes the conditions needed. You need the right supplies, understand the wind direction, the timing has to be right. Crucially, he states that after a fire attack, you must follow up immediately with troops.
Ah, so it's not a standalone tactic. It creates an opening.
Exactly. And he ends that section with a stark reminder. A state that is destroyed cannot be rebuilt. Use destructive means cautiously.
Which brings us to arguably the most emphasized element in the entire text, the use of spies. The source material is incredibly clear and forceful on this.
Intelligence. It's presented as the single most important factor, the most cost-effective way to get knowledge of the enemy.
He explicitly contrasts the huge cost and suffering of fielding, say, an army of 100,000 men.
Massive expense.
Against the relatively low cost of employing spies. Knowledge you get from spies is essential. You can't rely on intuition or guesswork or just hoping for the best.
No, you need facts. Hard intelligence.
And he breaks down the whole intelligence network into 5 specific classes of spies.
Okay, what are they?
Local spies using inhabitants of the enemy territory. Inward spies using enemy officials you can bribe or turn.
Inside sources.
Right. Converted spies captured enemy spies you persuade to work for you. Double agents, basically. Doomed spies.
Doomed.
Yeah. Spies you deliberately give false information to, knowing they'll likely be caught and feed that bad info to the enemy. Essentially sacrificed.
Wow. Ruthless.
And finally, surviving spies, the ones who actually get through, bring back accurate, critical information. He says the whole secret network only works effectively when you use all 5 types together.
A complex web. Managing that must require specific qualities.
He says so. The person overseeing it needs subtle intellect, integrity, benevolence, and sincerity. High standards.
And the stakes are incredibly high. If a secret leaks out before it's supposed to.
The spy involved, and potentially anyone they spoke to, is executed. No room for error.
Espionage isn't just important then. Sun Tzu calls it the most essential element in war. The entire army's ability to move and act effectively depends on good intelligence.
So, pulling all of this together, after this deep dive through these ancient writings, what are the core takeaways for you? What stands out?
Well, it's clearly about meticulous strategic planning before you act. Understanding the real costs involved in any conflict or major effort. Seeking non-violent ways to win if possible, that's supreme excellence. Deeply knowing both your own strengths and weaknesses and those of the situation or the opponent you face.
That's self-knowledge and enemy knowledge balance.
Exactly. Constant adaptability. Being able to read the subtle signs in your environment. Leveraging your resources and position effectively. Recognizing the absolute criticality of leadership, both good and bad.
And the potential pitfalls.
Right, and understanding that good information, good intelligence is often the most valuable asset you can possibly have.
So think about these principles not just in terms of armies in ancient China, but in your own life, right now.
Yeah, how do you apply knowing yourself and the enemy when you're, say, preparing for a tough negotiation at work?
Or how do you use deception, maybe not maliciously, but in the sense of managing expectations or strategic silence in a challenging conversation?
How do you identify the terrain of a complex project you're managing? Figure out the difficult ground, the open ground.
Or maybe use spies, not literal spies, obviously, but doing your research, gathering information thoroughly before making a big decision.
It's surprising how these ancient ideas really do resonate across so many modern challenges.
Yeah, from navigating office politics to prepping for a presentation.
Yeah.
These underlying dynamics of competition strategy, limited resources, they feel eerily familiar.
Yeah, they offer a kind of framework, I think, for understanding and acting in almost any situation where outcomes matter and, resources are involved.
Well, that was quite a journey through Sun Tzu's The Art of War. Drawing from these excerpts, we've definitely extracted some powerful, timeless wisdom from those ancient pages.
Absolutely. And perhaps the most thought-provoking idea to leave you with comes directly from the text itself. Sun Tzu stated, "In peace, prepare for war. In war, prepare for peace."
In peace, prepare for war. In war, prepare for peace. What does that duality mean for your life, for the challenges you face?
How can that discipline of preparing for potential challenges for war actually help you avoid conflict altogether?
And on the flip side, how does pursuing any significant goal, any war, require you to simultaneously think about the desired state of peace or resolution you're aiming for on the other side?
Something to consider maybe as you navigate your own strategic landscapes.